let yourself sink down. Dim the lights in your room, leaving only a narrow streak of golden glow across the table. Take a deep breath, release it slowly. Now close your eyes for a moment. When you open them again, the familiar wall before you is gone, replaced by a sweltering night in Babylon, 323 BC. The air is thick, the moisture from the Euphrates seeping through sun-baked brick walls that have held the day's furnace. Above, oil lamps flicker, their smoke mixing with the sharp fragrance of resin, heavy and biting in the nose. From afar, the steady hum of insects weaves into a ceaseless, fine-grained backdrop of sound. You sense yourself standing inside a vast chamber, its vaulted ceiling looming high, yet the heat presses down on every breath. At the very center of that chamber stands a young man. His figure is not overly tall, but his gaze gleams like a blade in the dark. A purple cloak drapes across his shoulders, his skin slick with sweat, his hands still stained with the dust of wine and the fumes of revelry from earlier that day. He is addressed by many titles: King of Macedonia, Conqueror of Persia, Master of nearly the entire known world. But one name alone compels all humanity to look up: Alexander. Alexander the Great, the king who had just turned 32, embodied strength and an unrelenting hunger to conquer. From a small Macedonian prince, he became the storm that swept away empires once thought unshakable. Stories tell that when Alexander looked upon the world's map of his age, he wept, not for loss, but because there remained too few lands left to subdue. Tonight, you and I stand in Babylon, the splendid city that was once the beating heart of the Eastern Empire. After his glorious victories, Alexander chose this as his new capital, the place where he planned yet another campaign southward. Yet the atmosphere here bears no calm. It hangs heavy, as though something momentous is about to unfold. Picture it. Outside, guards still pace the fortress walls, iron boots striking rhythm against stone. Within the palace, fires blaze bright, the banquet not yet dissolved. Laughter and clinking cups echo into the chambers of rest. But inside, the young king sits in silence, his eyes sinking into shadow. Some whisper that Alexander has drunk too much. Others claim he has just returned from a strange sacrificial rite, carrying both wine's haze and a smoldering fever within. And is in that stifling hour, within Babylon's lamp-lit walls, that our story begins. The tale of a king unbeaten in battle, yet brought down abruptly before the age of 33. His death opened a mystery spanning millennia, and his tomb, which should have stood as a symbol of absolute power, vanished without a trace. Are you ready to walk further with me? Step closer now, for from here we shall follow each milestone of Alexander's life, from his ambitious youth to the moment of his final breath, and the long, elusive journey of a tomb never found. Let your imagination lead the way. The door of time opens gently, carrying us away from the humid walls of Babylon, back more than 3 decades earlier to Pella, the modest capital of the Kingdom of Macedonia. The sky then was a deep blue, barley fields stretched endlessly, and the wind swept sharply across the hillsides. It was here that, in the summer of 356 BCE, a child first cried out at birth. That child was named Alexander. His father was King Philip II, a monarch of extraordinary military genius. He had transformed Macedonia, once dismissed as backward compared to the Greek city-states, into a formidable power. This father bore within him the cold edge of sword and spear, the cunning forged in countless campaigns, and an ambition no less than the son who would follow him. His mother, Olympias, princess of Epirus, was a woman both mysterious and commanding. People said she placed unshakable faith in sacred rites, even taking part in Dionysian festivals with serpents coiling around her body. It was Olympias who planted in the young Alexander the conviction that he was not merely human, that divine blood coursed through his veins. Legend even whispered that on the night Alexander was conceived, lightning flashed across the sky while Philip II dreamed of a lion. Now imagine it. To grow up in a court where every rumor, every dream was interpreted as an omen. How could such a child ever believe himself ordinary? Alexander's childhood was far from gentle. His father was mostly absent, consumed by military campaigns. His mother raised him on tales of Achilles, the hero of Troy. Alexander became so enraptured that he always kept a copy of the Iliad by his side, holding Achilles as the model he would strive to emulate for life. At the age of 7, he was sent to study under the finest teachers of the land. But the true turning point came when Alexander was about 13. The man invited to instruct the young prince was none other than Aristotle, the great philosopher, pupil of Plato. Picture a summer afternoon at Mysa, in a lush garden beneath the shade of oaks, where Aristotle lectured on the cosmos, on ethics, on politics, while Alexander listened intently. In those teenage years, he absorbed not only philosophy, but also medicine, mathematics, poetry, and the art of leadership. Aristotle gave him more than knowledge. He instilled the belief that this vast world could be held within one's grasp, if guided by both intellect and the sword. And the boy received it all, eyes burning with the brightness of one destined to enter history. There is a story often retold. While Alexander was still a youth, King Philip purchased a wild, unbroken horse no one at court could master. Yet Alexander, after watching carefully, discerned that the animal feared its own shadow. He turned its head toward the sun, mounted, and rode it with ease. That horse was Buphalysus, who would remain his companion through every campaign of his life. In taming Buphalysus, Alexander seemed to ascend one step higher in fate's design. No longer just a courtly child, but a warrior in the making. Picture it. Beneath a blazing morning sun, across the fields of Pella, a golden-haired boy spurred his horse into flight, dust billowing, onlookers cheering in astonishment and delight. Philip himself exclaimed, "My son, you must seek a kingdom worthy of you, for Macedonia is far too small." Those words, like a prophecy, settled upon Alexander in his youth. He no longer saw borders in his narrow homeland. In his mind, the world beyond, the Aegean Sea, the deserts of Egypt, the distant Himalayas, all stood waiting as his stage.
And from that childhood, a flame smoldered in Alexander's heart, the fire of one who believed he was born to go farther than anything his father had ever achieved.
Imagine, on an autumn morning in 336 BC, the capital of Pella trembled with dreadful news. King Philip II, who had only just taken a new wife, fell to an assassin's blade during his daughter's wedding. The court was thrown into chaos, shrouded in plots and suspicion as thick as the night fog. And in that storm of upheaval, a young man of 20 was thrust onto the throne. His name was Alexander. Picture him, a youth barely past adolescence, now draped in royal robes, carrying the weight of an empire already in turmoil. Around him stood hardened generals, their bodies marked by scars from 100 battles, and Greek city-states that still looked upon Macedonia with doubt and disdain. Few believed that someone so young could endure. Yet Alexander chose to answer not with words, but with deeds. Only weeks after his coronation, he marched south toward Thebes. Long a defiant adversary of Macedonia, became his first trial. And there you see a decision etched forever in history. Alexander showed no mercy. Thebes fell within days, its city leveled to the ground, spared only the temples and the house of poet Pindar. The message was unmistakable. Betrayal would meet a brutal end. When word of Thebes' destruction reached Athens, the city trembled. Other city-states hurried to send envoys in submission. In less than a year, Alexander, the young king, had transformed Greece from a fractured collection of states into a force united beneath his command. At Corinth, he was named commander of the Greek League, tasked with leading a war of vengeance against Persia, the age-old foe that had ravaged Greek soil a century earlier. Do you hear it? The thunder of hooves pounding the earth, the roar of soldiers in unison. And at the head of the surging army, Alexander astride Bucephalus, his gaze fixed eastward, where the Persian Empire stretched for thousands of miles. An empire that seemed invincible. But to Alexander, it was not a wall to halt him, but an invitation to conquest. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the strait dividing Europe and Asia. Legend says that as soon as he set foot on Asia Minor shore, he hurled his spear into the earth, proclaiming it the spear point of a new age of conquest. The Battle of the Granicus erupted soon after. Amidst the swirling dust of tens of thousands of cavalry and infantry, Alexander drove his forces into the Persian line. He nearly lost his life when a Persian commander's sword swung down at his head, but the blow was stopped, and Alexander himself struck the fatal counter. From that moment, the young king's renown spread across Asia Minor. But it did not end there. A year later came an even greater trial, the Battle of Issus. The Persian army, vast and overwhelming, led by King Darius III himself, outnumbered and outshone Alexander's forces. Picture that afternoon swept by fierce winds, with the Cilician Sea on one side and towering mountains on the other. The narrow pass turned into a trap of death. Yet, Alexander overturned the odds. He rode Bucephalus at the vanguard of his cavalry charge, spear leveled straight at the Persian center, forcing Darius to flee amidst chaos. In that moment, something remarkable happened. The young king of Macedonia, not yet 25, had shaken the throne of the largest empire on earth. He conquered not only with sword and shield, but with audacity, a force that left his enemies stunned by his speed and reckless daring. Do you hear it clearly now? The drums of Issus still echo, but a legend had already been born. Alexander, Once the doubted boy king of 20 had become the invincible one, and the journey pressed on. From Greece to Persia, from blood-soaked roads to dazzling cities, Alexander would march ever deeper into the stage of the world, each victory drawing him closer to his final destiny in Babylon.
Follow the hoofprints. Leave behind the narrow shores of Issus and step into a longer, harsher journey, one where Alexander's name would not only thunder across Greece, but strike terror deep into the heart of Persia. After the victory at Issus, the road ahead lay open. In 332 BCE, Alexander led his forces south toward Tyre, a fortified port city set in the sea. The walls of Tyre rose sky high, waves battering its sides on all horizons, a citadel that for generations had defied armies. Picture it. Most generals would shake their heads before such colossal stone walls, but Alexander did not. He commanded the building of a massive causeway, stretching from land to island. Step by step, under a rain of arrows and stones, the giant structure crept forward. 7 months of siege, the sea stained red with blood, until at last Tyre fell. The city lay in ruins, yet from its wreckage the world learned a truth, that Alexander accepted no limits, not even the sea. The gateway to the east opened wider still. In Egypt, instead of resistance, Alexander was welcomed as a savior. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, flung open their gates in offering. He traveled along the Nile, the desert sun casting fire over his purple cloak, and there he raised a new city, Alexandria. Imagine it. On endless white sands, rows of stone columns rising, a young conqueror's eternal dream etched in stone. Yet the summit of conquest had not arrived. It waited on the fields of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. This was no mere battle, but the clash of two worlds. Small yet unyielding Macedonia against the mighty Persian Empire that stretched from the Nile to India. Picture the dawn at Gaugamela. Mist still veiled the earth, the vast grasslands trembling in the first light of day. Before you, endless Persian ranks stretched to the horizon. Cavalry, war elephants, chariots armed with flashing blades. On the other side, Alexander stood with a force only a fraction of that size. He did not falter. Mounted on Bucephalus, he rode forward, his command for attack thundering out as war drums cracked like storm clouds. His tactics stunned the enemy. Alexander swung his cavalry obliquely to the right, pulling the Persian lines wide, then suddenly turned and drove straight into the heart. An opening yawned before him, and in a flash, the Macedonian cavalry pierced through like an arrow striking the enemy's chest. Darius, king of Persia, once again fled in panic. When the dust settled, the fields of Gaugamela lay strewn with the dead, while above, Alexander's name blazed brighter than ever. Only 25 years old, he had torn into the heart of the greatest empire on earth. From that moment, Alexander was no longer king of Macedonia. The world began to call him the Great. Can you hear it? The soldiers' shouts, the pounding of breath, the crackle of fires still smoldering on the battlefield. That night, under a pale moon, Alexander walked among the fallen, his eyes burning with a strange light. Not the joy of victory, but the hunger to march farther still. For Persia was not his end. The path of conquest stretched onward to the east, where mountains and great rivers awaited the footsteps of a young man who believed the world itself had been born for him to claim.
Step away for a moment from the blood-soaked fields of Gaugamela and walk southward to where dazzling sunlight pours down and endless white sands stretch to the horizon. This is Egypt, the land where the Nile winds like a green ribbon through the burning gold of the desert. After one victory upon another, Alexander entered this land not with sword and spear, but with the bearing of a savior. The Egyptians, long weary of Persian rule, greeted him with open arms, their voices rising in acclaim as though welcoming a king sent from the heavens. Picture the scene. Crowds pressed along the river roads, torches flickering, incense smoke curling thick into the air. High above them, Alexander rode Bucephalus, his cloak streaming in the desert wind, his calm gaze surveying the sea of faces. In that instant, he was no longer merely a conqueror. He had become a new pharaoh, a divine symbol embraced by this sacred land. Here, Alexander made a fateful decision. He would found a city bearing his own name, Alexandria. Stand with him on the sands of the Mediterranean shore, where the salt wind stings the face and the waves strike endlessly. Alexander stretched out his hand toward the horizon and told his architects, "Here shall be my city, a city open to the great sea, where Greece and Egypt shall be joined as one." Plans were drawn, columns raised from stone foundations, and Alexandria began to rise from the white sands. It was not only a city, but the embodiment of a young man's dream, to forge an empire not just vast, but the uniting civilizations apart in spirit. Can you hear it? The hammers strike on stone, the creak of timber set upright, the waves mingling with the cries of laborers. They built temples, harbors, a library, destined to become the greatest treasury of human knowledge. Alexandria was more than a city. It was a declaration that Alexander's legacy would not rest solely on fields drenched in blood, but upon works that endured with time itself. Yet, it was not only the city. Alexander went further still. He journeyed deep into the desert to the oasis of Siwa. There, amid the barren seas of sand, stood an ancient shrine, the temple of Ammon, the god whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. Within its walls, the priests hailed Alexander as the son of the god. Imagine that moment, torches blazing in the sanctuary, incense smoke winding up into the high rafters, and the young king standing upright, hearing the words spoken by the oracle. He smiled, and in his eyes burned an unshakable conviction that in his veins flowed divine blood. From then on, Alexander was no longer merely the king of Macedonia. He had become a figure beyond borders, the bearer of destiny, a man ordained to rule the world. And what do you see in this moment? A radiant city rising from the sands, a king revered as a god, and a dream swelling larger. A dream of an empire stretching from Greece in the west to the farthest edge of the eastern sky. But remember this, light always walks beside shadow. The farther he went, the closer he drew to his dream, the more the road ahead of Alexander began to crack beneath the weight of hidden fractures. Step out of the Egyptian desert and continue with Alexander across the Iranian plateau, along the barren roads of Persia. The path to the east unfolds, leading straight to the sheer ridges of the Hindu Kush. There, the wind cuts like knives, and clouds shroud the peaks capped with blinding snow. It is said the Macedonian army marched for days in that biting cold. Horses collapsed, soldiers froze to death, yet Alexander remained atop Bucephalus at the head of his men, his gaze never faltering. Can you picture it? An exhausted army dragged forward only by the iron will of one man. They crossed mountains even predators feared until they reached the fertile valleys of Bactria. And here, fate placed before Alexander a figure who would become a symbol in his life, Roxana. Roxana, daughter of a local noble, beautiful with eyes bright as mountain lakes, skin bronzed by the highland sun, and a strength that rivaled any man. The storytellers of old recalled that fateful meeting. At a banquet following victory, Alexander saw her, and his gaze lingered long. This was not a political marriage like those of kings before him, but an irresistible pull from the heart. They became husband and wife, and from then on, Roxana's name was bound forever to the legend of Alexander. But love did not slow the march of conquest. In the monsoon of 326 BC, Alexander's army entered India. Before them lay the Hydaspes River, where King Porus, a towering warrior mounted on an elephant, stood at the head of tens of thousands, blocking their way. Imagine the sight: rain pouring down in torrents, the river surging wild, thunder cracking overhead. Across the banks, elephants bellowed, pounding the ground beneath them. Each step of the beasts thundered like a death knell in Macedonian hearts. Yet Alexander, soaked in his heavy cloak, did not retreat. He split his forces, crossing the river in secret at night, and struck Porus's flank without warning. Battle erupted in chaos. The clash of weapons, the shrieks of elephants, the cries of dying men merged into a single storm of sound. At moments it seemed the Macedonians would be crushed beneath elephant feet, but Alexander himself led the cavalry strike at the enemy's side, turning the tide. When it ended, thousands of bodies lay strewn beneath the unrelenting rain. Porus, though defeated, stood tall before Alexander. When asked how he wished to be treated, he replied, "As a king." Alexander spared him, making Porus a vassal and leaving him to rule his land. It was not merely a military victory, but a triumph of respect between men who proved themselves worthy. Do you hear this clearly? The Battle of Hydaspes did more than add territory to Alexander's empire. It etched into history the image of a young king bowing before the dignity of his foe. But after that victory, the path of conquest grew heavier. Endless rains, the vastness of India, the exhaustion of men. In damp nights, as the drum of rain beat against the tents, Alexander sat silent, his eyes distant. Though his hunger for conquest remained, he could hear the whispers of his soldiers. They longed to return home. And so, like a storm too long endured, the great army was finally forced to halt. Alexander, the man who had never once yielded to an enemy, at last had to yield to the weariness of his own men. Listen closely. After the fierce battles in India, the army that once struck fear into the world began to show its fractures. No longer the roar of victory, but sighs, weary stirrings in damp nights. The soldiers who had followed Alexander for 10 long years, from Macedon, Asia Minor, and Egypt all the way to the Hydaspes, now bore faces etched with exhaustion. Imagine an evening after a long rain. In the camp, fires flicker faintly. Kitchen smoke mingles with the scent of rusting armor. Macedonian warriors sit in a circle, eyes hollow. They long for home, for their fields, for the warmth of family meals. Alexander, burning with his dream of reaching the eastern sea, wanted to march farther still. But whispers rose louder in the ranks. "We have gone far enough." It was more than fatigue. Dissatisfaction was growing in the heart of the army itself. Veterans who had shared every hardship now felt their king had changed. Alexander increasingly presented himself as divine, adopting Persian rituals, demanding subjects bow before him. To the proud, free Macedonian warriors, this was an insult. The shadow of suspicion crept through every corner of the camp. Do you hear it? The rasp of knives being sharpened in tents, the murmur of plotting voices. A few assassination schemes stirred. Some were discovered, punished with execution, and those deaths only thickened the heavy air. Alexander, once the approachable commander, now seemed like a distant god. Admiration still lingered, but it was entwined with fear. Then a crushing blow struck his soul. Hephaestion, the closest companion, the comrade from youth, the man Alexander trusted above all, fell ill. Soon after, Hephaestion died. Picture that scene, a misty morning. In a small chamber, Hephaestion lay motionless, his eyes closed forever. Alexander sat beside him, clutching his friend's hand, his face turned to stone. That death broke Alexander more than any battle ever had. He wept, he raged, he cut his hair. He refused food and ordered a funeral of kingly grandeur. For days, his gaze was dark, no longer the blazing fire of the battlefield, but a dying flame in the wind of fate. From then on, Alexander was no longer himself. The grief of losing his soulmate drove him deeper into banquets, strong wine, and ambitious plans his soldiers no longer wished to pursue. He spoke more and more of gods, of divine destiny, as if only through that could he fill the emptiness inside. You can feel it clearly. The army that was once a solid wall of steel had cracked. One Alexander still yearned to march on, but another was being consumed by the darkness of loss and suspicion. And those fractures, born within the very heart of the empire, were leading him step by step to Babylon, where his final fate awaited. Step across the red dust plains of Asia, cross the Tigris, and set foot in Babylon, the city that was once the heart of the East. In 323 BC, Alexander returned here after years of conquest, carrying in his hands an empire that stretched across the known world. He dreamed of new campaigns, of lands no one had ever set foot upon. But fate had chosen this place to close the chapter of the young king's life. Imagine then a stifling summer night. In the palace of Babylon, oil lamps burned bright, incense smoke drifted in a haze, mingling with the sound of lutes and drums beating the rhythm of a lavish feast. Greek wine, spices from the east, roasted meat thick with aroma. Soldiers and officers laughed, their cups clashing in a chorus of iron. At the center, Alexander raised his goblet, eyes blazing, his voice ringing out as though urging the whole world forward. And yet, amid the laughter, there came a strange pause. The young king suddenly stiffened, his hand clutching his chest. The burn of wine surged upward with fire in his throat. He sat down, his brow slick with sweat, lips cracked and dry. Outside, hot winds from the Euphrates pressed in, making the lamps flicker, shadows trembling against the baked brick walls. Whispers began to spread through the hall. Alexander had fallen ill. In the days that followed, fever tightened its grip. At first, it was only heat in his body, but soon came the shivering chills, the long stabs of pain in his belly. Picture the scene inside that vast chamber of the Babylonian palace. Alexander lying on his bed, his cloak drenched with sweat, his eyes closed, his breath heavy and strained. Beside him, generals came one by one to visit, yet he no longer had the strength to answer. Some say that whenever he tried to sit up, Alexander had to lean on his attendants, his voice hoarse and broken. He ordered plans to be written for a campaign into Arabia, but the papers scattered as his trembling hands failed him. As the days dragged on, whispers grew sharper. Some claimed he had been poisoned. Others insisted it was malaria or typhoid, the lurking illnesses of Babylon's sweltering air. Listen to the sounds in that chamber. No more the lutes or the drums of the feast. Instead, only the drip of water from a jar, the cloth soaking up sweat, the ragged wheeze of breath that faltered and broke. Alexander's eyes opened faintly, scanning the room, as though he longed to speak, but only his lips moved without sound. Outside, soldiers thronged in their thousands before the palace gates. They wished to see their king one last time. Alexander gave the sign, and they carried him out on a stretcher. As the ranks of men filed past, they saw the king's eyes open, gazing at each one in turn. No words, no voice. That was his final farewell. And on that suffocating night, beneath the wavering light of oil lamps, the king who had marched across half the world closed his eyes forever, not yet 33 years old. Can you feel it? No battle drums, no songs of triumph, only the fading breath within the palace of Babylon. The sudden death of Alexander left a vast void of power and a mystery that humanity has never resolved.
Sit down, take a deep breath, and try to picture the final moment of the young king. Alexander, the man who had crossed mountains and rivers, who once raised his sword and shook the Persian Empire, was now nothing more than a frail body lying on a sickbed in Babylon. Death came too swiftly, too suddenly, and for more than 2,000 years humanity has continued to argue, why did Alexander the Great fall? Some records say that for days on end he burned with relentless fever, trembling and unable to speak. The symptoms mirrored the very plagues that haunted those humid lands: malaria, typhoid, infections from river water swarming with insects. Ancient physicians were powerless, while later generations tried to trace every clue in the old texts. If it was disease, then his death was but a cruel accident of nature. But don't you feel it? That such an ordinary ending seems unworthy to close the story of a legend. And so other whispers began to rise. Some claimed he was poisoned. Picture a cup of wine at a stifling banquet, the taste of grapes mingling with something strange, enough for pain to creep in slowly, tightening its grip day after day. They speak of veratrum album, a deadly extract from the white hellebore plant, capable of causing convulsions, gradual paralysis, leaving the body warm while the soul was trapped in silence. Could it be that Alexander remained conscious yet helplessly watched the world around him as his body betrayed him? More modern theories suggest Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disorder that causes muscles to lose control. This would explain why the king was still aware enough to greet his soldiers, yet unable to utter a word. Think about it. What tragedy is greater than for the man who once commanded tens of thousands, whose voice could shake battlefields, to die in silence, unable to leave even a final farewell? Be it plague, poison, or rare illness, they all share one truth. There is no absolute proof. And it is precisely this void, this haze of uncertainty, that has turned Alexander's death into one of history's greatest mysteries. Can you hear it? The murmurs in Babylon's palace, the guards passing rumors from ear to ear, the hurried footsteps of generals rushing down the halls. That death did not only take away a king, it tore open the heart of an empire. For Alexander departed without naming a successor. He left behind a world unsettled, a dream unfinished, and a body destined to become the centerpiece of bloody struggles for power. And from that very last breath, a greater mystery began to unfold. Where would his body go? Where would his tomb be? Would it be a grand mausoleum befitting the conqueror of the world? Or a trace buried and lost, hidden from all eyes for more than 2,000 years? Imagine this. After the sudden death in Babylon, Alexander's body became a sacred relic. It was no longer merely the corpse of a man, but the remains of a king, of a legend, of an empire unlike any the world had seen. And because of this, every strip of cloth that wrapped him, every drop of resin and honey used in his embalming carried immeasurable weight and power. It is said that Alexander's body was placed in a golden coffin, tightly bound in layers of linen soaked with resin and honey. When his army prepared to bring him back to Macedonia to rest beside the ancestors of the Argead house, a fateful turn occurred. Ptolemy, his trusted general and later the founder of Egypt's dynasty, secretly seized the coffin and carried it to Memphis. Picture this, a silent escort moving across the desert, wheels grinding against the sand, the scorching sun burning down on the carriage that bore the king's body. Behind it was not only a funeral procession, but the beginning of a struggle over legacy itself. From Memphis, Alexander's body was transferred to Alexandria, the city he had founded with his own vision. There, a magnificent mausoleum was raised, where the light of the Mediterranean gleamed on polished white marble. Roman emperors in later centuries, Caesar, Augustus, and others, came to pay homage. Some accounts say Augustus placed a wreath on the mummy, while Caligula stripped away the armor, claiming it as a relic. For centuries, Alexander's tomb became a pilgrimage site for rulers, as if touching his remains meant seizing destiny itself. And then, the trail vanished. By the 4th century, wars, earthquakes, and the slow burial of time covered Alexandria. The tomb of Alexander was lost, and no one knew its exact location again. The few surviving texts offer only scattered hints. Some claimed it lies buried beneath the modern city. Others believed it was hidden to prevent plunder. Still others whispered that the body was moved elsewhere, beyond all discovery. Feel the strangeness of it. A man who shook the world, who brought cities to their knees, has no fixed place of rest. His tomb, meant to be the greatest of monuments, disappeared,
as if history itself had swallowed it whole. The wind of the Mediterranean still sweeps through Alexandria, along white stone streets, past ruined temples. If you stood there today, gazing down through layers of earth and sand, you might wonder, could the emperor's sleep still lie beneath? Or has Alexander gone forever, vanishing with his tomb to remain an eternal mystery?
Sit back and listen to the stories no one can ever prove, yet have been whispered for centuries around the name of Alexander. For when a king dies young, when his tomb vanishes, the most natural thing people do is to weave legends. There are tales that Alexander's body never decayed. When the coffin was opened many years later, his form was still intact, his face radiant as if asleep. People believed it to be a divine sign. Alexander was not merely a man, he was the son of Zeus Ammon, and the gods had claimed him for themselves. Yet others whispered that precisely because his body was preserved, it became fuel for the ambitions of his successors. Whoever possessed the king's remains would hold destiny itself. Then more rumors spread. Some said his body was buried beneath Alexandria, but after countless earthquakes, the city buried everything under layers of stone and sand. Another theory claimed that in the chaos of Roman times, the golden coffin was looted and Alexander's remains lost forever. A stranger legend told that a group of priests hid his body in a secret temple so that his soul would never be disturbed. Picture the moment when a Roman emperor, Augustus, stepped into the tomb. Torchlight fell upon the motionless face of Alexander. The young emperor bowed his head and laid a wreath. History records that instant, but after Augustus, the traces fade. Caligula seized the armor, Severus sought to seal the tomb, and Caracalla wept before the embalmed king as if before an idol. And then no one spoke of it again. Today, archaeologists still search. They dig beneath churches, beneath the markets of Alexandria, beneath the dust-choked streets, yet they find only fragments, never certain if they belong to the lost tomb. Century after century, new theories are built, but the mystery remains whole. Can you feel the strangeness of it? It is this disappearance that turned Alexander into a legend. Had his tomb been found, it might stand as nothing more than a relic. But because it vanished, he became an immortal enigma, a door that has never opened. And so, the rumors, the tales without proof, keep Alexander alive forever in human imagination. A king who conquered the world, a death without clear cause, and a tomb that dissolved into the shadows.
Sit quietly for a moment. More than 2,000 years have passed since that sweltering night in Babylon, yet the name of Alexander the Great has never faded. Though his tomb is lost, though the cause of his death remains a mystery, his legacy flows on like an unending current, threading through every page of history, every dream of humankind. Look back. A young man of 20 who unified Greece, shattered the Persian Empire, crossed the deserts of Egypt, wed a princess of Bactria, and built an empire stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the river Indus. His battles, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Hydaspes, were not only military milestones, but also symbols of daring will, of an ambition that refused to rest. Alexander left behind more than battlefields. He left behind cities. Alexandria in Egypt became a center of civilization, where the great library once gathered the knowledge of the world. The roads he opened, the trade routes he forged, the exchanges of culture he set in motion changed the course of history. Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Indians, all began to know of one another through the bridge Alexander built with blood and sweat. And perhaps what made him immortal was not only territory or triumphs, it was the mystery. A king dying young, not yet 33, leaving the world while still dreaming of new campaigns. A tomb erected, then vanished from the eyes of men. That absence turned Alexander into a question that has never been fully answered. And because the answer is still missing, his name still lives. Can you hear it? The pounding of hooves echoing from the pages of history, the war drums still reverberating in the distance, and the whispers of archaeologists sifting layer after layer of earth in today's Alexandria, hoping one day to uncover a trace. But until the stone doorway is revealed, Alexander will remain a legend. And now, as you close this journey, ask yourself, does immortality come from conquering the world, or from leaving behind a mystery that the world will never cease to seek?